If we care about our democracy, we've got to care about the issue of wokeism. And I want to follow up on a calm recent exchange here on YouTube about wokeism that took place between Lewis from the Then and Now channel and Hans-Georg Moeller from the Carefree Wandering channel. I don't want to give a systematic account of either of their videos, but I want to just chat with you kind of informally about what's missing from the conversation so far and where it might go in the future. And this is not just videos about videos about videos about videos, because this is an important topic if we're going to understand how centrist political forces and left political forces, particularly in the Western world, are going to, if they ever can, liberate themselves out of the apolitical hold that identity politics has taken over them. That's, of course, my view of what's happening. So let's get into it a little bit. I think that the problem so far with Lewis is that he hasn't managed to get in touch with the phenomena yet. He is not clear what he's looking at. And therefore, I don't think he's offering a bad analysis of wokeism. He is not touching the subject yet. And that's, I think, true for most progressive people in the West, perhaps 90%. And that's why discussions of wokeism that completely miss it, but are nevertheless calm and rational and engaging and thoughtful, are worth looking at, as opposed to actually dismissing. The problem on Hans-Georg Moeller's side isn't very big, actually, but it's that he keeps talking about the sovereign individual, and quite frankly, it's not clear what he means. I mean, I'm sure it's clear what he means once he's able to elaborate this idea, but on the basis of his recent videos, it seems to me the majority of his viewers won't know what he means, and those who think they do must be wrong. I mean, there are, of course, certain ethical conceptions of the individual, and we have various conflicting ethical conceptions of the individual in the West. But there are also explanatory conceptions of the individual that are more or less substantial. And at one extreme, you could take a view which says that there is no explanation at the individual level, it's substantive. And that's to say anything really that you want to explain, you have to explain by other means. So that's, of course, an insane view, but what's the logical terminus of a view like that? Well, it's that individuals don't really decide anything, and that therefore, if Hans-Georg Moeller releases a video, if Hans-Georg Moeller was just evaporated out of thin air, somebody else would have made that same video. If Beethoven didn't compose his piano sonatas, somebody else would have composed his piano sonatas. No, nobody really can believe that, and of course we agree on that. But there isn't an account of collective explanation or social explanation that can be severed from an account of individual explanation. And of course, to the silliness that we've just added on the anti-individualist side, we can add a sort of radical pro-individualist silliness. And that's a kind of silliness that says, look, everything can be explained in terms of the intentions and psychological states of individuals. And again, I think we had better dismiss this. Now, there are some important thinkers in the past who are at risk of not dismissing this. One really great 20th century public intellectual, Isaiah Berlin, was at risk of making this error. And I think one of the things that Isaiah always was in danger of was thinking that there could be a psychological explanation of something, an historical explanation of something, but that was it. In other words, there wasn't a place for something like social explanation, for something like what we might call sociology, to give us a story about how something like the outbreak of the Second World War happened. All you've got are various bits of historical explanation, various bits of psychological explanation, and you can't really get beyond that. I mean, you could also give an historical account of ideas, some intellectual history, and how ideas interact with practice, but that's often the point at which Isaiah ran out of steam and sort of went on as though sociological explanation was a sort of an unavailable category. So it's important to not take the substantiveness of individual explanation to such an extreme that you think there is nothing else, because that'll mean you can't explain a damn thing, and that you're just going to be sillily walking around thinking individuals explain everything, and you're going to be a kind of sort of, bizarre, sort of even unfaithful, perhaps, follower of some kind of pop Ayn Rand trend. Or on the other hand, you could be some kind of a hyper-extremist Marxist at the level of social explanation. I think individuals just don't matter at all. So there isn't anything wrong with Hans-Georg Moeller's position on the face of what I've heard, but it's just not clear what it is. And therefore, the ongoing references to the sovereign individual do leave any reflective viewer without requisite clarity. Now, presumably, there are certain conceptions of the individual that Hans-Georg Moeller is challenging, and he thinks that they are illusory. Well, there are good gestures he makes toward what they are, but it's not quite exactly clear what they are. Now, one of the other issues that sort of arises in this conversation is whether wokeism is a religious thing at all, or whether it has significant religious connotations. And Hans-Georg Moeller makes persuasive points about this, and I'm going to link up his videos below. What do I say about this? I think what I say about it is that wokeism goes with a kind of fantasy of deliverance that imagines a transcendent future in which we have left behind social conflict, political conflict, and perhaps even, disturbingly, intellectual and aesthetic divergence. So there is a kind of psychology that's half believed by people, nobody could fully believe it, that you can speak to people as though the terminus of the conversation you're having is some kind of future that via, a flawed lapse into magical thinking, you think is in principle, if not in practice, available, and in that future there'll be no disagreement. So you can kind of proceed as though fundamental substantive conflict in society is temporary. And I do think that that fantasy does have a kind of religious resonance. Now, whether this is a matter of enlightenment or not enlightenment is always a complex question, because the autocritique of enlightenment is very powerful, and enlightenment leaves us the resources for very powerful critiques of it. But it certainly is worth noting that there is a tradition of a kind of millenarian, fantastically religious liberalism, which even John Stuart Mill was not immune from. He was so sophisticated that he kept nuancing his thought to take a greater distance from that kind of picture. But that picture had a gravitational pull on J.S. Mill, and is an ineliminable part of at least what motivates his account of human flourishing, that eventually we could arrive at some kind of a convergence of this kind, that's a thought worth having, as it were. Whatever we make of it, that's a thought worth having for Mill. So what else is then really missing from the exchange so far? And what's really missing for me is politics, quite frankly. I do think that the left-wing critique that Hans-Georg Moeller gives of wokeism, which you can discover in his video, is a pretty solid critique. I don't share it entirely, but it's a pretty solid critique, and it's legitimate, admissible. But for me, there still isn't a real political context here, whereby we're saying, well, how does this really matter? What does this do for us? How does this affect our lives? And we are in the realm of talking about an issue that's putting in danger the survival of our democracy. And so we'd better make it real, we'd better make it political. Now, Western democracy is in a period of decline now that's irreversible. Western democracy is a boat going out of the bay into the open ocean. It won't sink, but in the open ocean, the waters will be bumpy and we need to get ready for it. We can halt this decline in various ways. We can't entirely arrest it. We can't reverse it. It's probably the biggest crisis of trust in politics since the middle of the 19th century. And that's not to say it's the biggest crisis in politics since then, not at all. It's the biggest crisis of trust in politics, and a crisis of trust in institutions, a crisis of trust in trust, a crisis of a kind of political opacity. And you see, opacity is always worse than looking at something and thinking that it's bad, or looking at something and thinking that it's working against you, namely your political system. Because looking at your political system and thinking that it looks opaque to you, that you can't recognize it, there's a kind of aura of unintelligibility about it. When you look at it, you see 4 or 5 different sports games being played. You don't know what the rules are. In fact, there aren't any rules as far as you can tell. That's a very big problem. And that makes very many citizens vulnerable to what I call non-constitutional right-wing politicians. Politicians who are on the right and imperceptibly, like water coming to the boil, come out of and sort of extricate themselves from commitments to democratic procedure, to the process and ritual of life in a democracy, which essentially entails viewing with a degree of sacredness counter-majoritarian institutions, whether that be the courts or independent media. And so we've got to ground this politically. And how do we do that? Where does wokeism come in to this political crisis? It's about democratic decline. And I think that wokeism comes in by infecting one party, or one set of parties in our political map, and depoliticizing them. You know, whether we're talking about folks on the left, whether we're talking about folks in the center, the effect of wokeism is to substitute a constructive preoccupation with power and change and agency that brings about change. Who is going to do what, how, and when, by what means, to involvement with identity. And that involvement with identity has a depoliticizing effect. In other words, it's debatable, for instance, that the reckoning we're currently having with racism in the West is positive culturally. That's a debate. But it seems to me it's less plausible to argue, still a debate, but it's less plausible to argue that it's constructive politically. And to this extent, I completely am unsympathetic to Hans-Georg Moeller's remarks that wokeism is a positive agent for change in the world. I think it's an agent of democratic decline. It's an agent of depoliticization. And it's an agent that is sort of ironic, really, in the sense that we're talking about work people being asleep, being politically asleep. We have got workers' capture of major institutions in the West. Take a very minor example from just a couple of weeks ago in the UK. The Green Party, to some degree, imploded. Their leader resigned over the issue of trans rights. And the issue was that Sean Berry, the leader of the Green Party in the UK, thought that trans rights cannot possibly be said to ever clash with women's rights. Somebody else, high up in the Green Party, thought that there could sometimes be a conflict between trans rights and women's rights, and that needed to be negotiated. And that position was found by Shan, who is actually a very admirable and serious and lovely person, except being deeply delusional in this respect. But this was found to be beyond the pale. So we've got a raging climate crisis, and we've got an environmentally centrist party self-immolating over a microscopic division of opinion about an identity politics issue that affects a fraction of a percent of the population. And it's not as though the other side was being transparently transphobic. They were saying trans rights matter, but sometimes there can be a conflict. Now, I'm not going to make the argument now, but a similar kind of capture certainly occurs in the Labour Party in the UK. In a slightly different way, there are aspects of the same capture happening in the Democratic Party in the United States. And here, quite rightly, Hans-Georg Moeller can come in and wheel out his point that here we are doing identity politics and advertising them in CIA ads as we engage in all kinds of unlovely status quo perpetuating and status quo degrading actions while jumping up and down about how we are, embracing CIA employees who are of unusual gender identity and are ethnic minorities. So this is a conversation that's ongoing on this channel. It's an important conversation to have because what we're looking at is a situation where the right is more of a risk than the left in our politics today. But for the risk of the right to be mitigated, we have got to have folks who are rather alert on the left, and instead we've got total coma. We have got a catastrophic decline of center-left, centrist and leftist politics in the West. And the wokeist story is a big part of that of the explanation for it. Whether it explains 20% of it, 30% of it, 18% of it, that's a separate story. We'll break that down in the future. But this is really, really important stuff. This is not about YouTube videos. This is about us keeping our democracy from sliding too much in the direction of Hungary and Poland, and beyond Hungary and Poland, there lies Belarus. So this is really, really important. Of course, there is also academic capture that's happening as a result of wokeism. Just to stay with the trans example we have raised, Kathleen Stock, a philosopher here in the UK, has been in all kinds of ways inappropriately pursued and tormented and deplatformed for taking a position that, whatever you think of it, is a reasonable position, which is, again, that trans rights matter, but they clash with women's rights sometimes, and when they do, there's got to be a political resolution. Sometimes Kathleen goes beyond that and says women's rights should trump when there is a conflict, and that, to that extent, we might not follow her 100% of the way, but the point is, she is making an absolutely legitimate claim in principle that I think is actually correct. But even if you think it's incorrect, it's certainly a reasonable contribution to the table of discussion. So is there anything that's going to tie all of these sorts of threads that I have opened without closing about wokeism? Any kind of image that could help us? And I think that there is. And that image is of people who want to reimagine the table of politics as though the people sitting with them at the table of politics weren't the people really sitting there. So I'm sitting here with Bob and Ricky, I don't like them, and I want to reimagine my table of politics as though Bob and Ricky were the kind of people I want to have sitting with me at the table of politics. You can't do that. We are now at risk of having a problem whereby citizens aren't ready to address themselves to all other citizens, and where institutions are not ready to address themselves to all other institutions. And this is where we come to the issue of not just the capture of political parties, but the capture of journalistic institutions. If the BBC television, BBC radio is still very open, but if BBC television and if the New York Times are captured by identity politics, and that capture is indeed recognized as the right path forward by about 10% of the population. Here, Hans-Georg Moeller is quite wrong to say that his opinion is in the minority about wokeism. His opinion is not in the minority. The Guardian and New York Times opinion is in the minority. The then and now opinion is in the minority, in a tiny minority as well. And we've got to be aware of that we have got institutional capture of the NYT, institutional capture of parts of BBC television. And the problem with that capture is it's a kind of a fake pretense. And the pretense is that you have won a political fight you haven't won. We've got people who have made a case that's persuaded 10% of the population, acting as though there is reasonable convergence about this between all citizens. And it's in that context that in the future we're going to have a nuanced conversation about taking the knee, a conversation that puts front and center the fact that we do have systemic racism, and puts front and center that even when we can eliminate the possibility of racisms of exclusion operating, we can still take very seriously the reality of racisms of deprioritization taking place. But allowing for that, allowing for the importance of a far from completed social justice project there, we can still raise real questions about the political efficacy of identity politics as a vehicle to carry these political projects forward, as opposed to immobilize them completely. This is what we've got to talk about. And unless we talk about it, we're going to stop looking out onto what's really happening in our societies. We're going to talk about all of this more. Thanks a lot.